is Andrew Fuse. I work with the Church World Service in New York on its immigration and refugee program. First, I want to thank Dr. Singh for a very good and very thorough presentation. I learned a lot from it. And Ruth also for her comment on the paths, which made me think about migration as an issue also in terms of thinking about legal empowerment and issues of poverty and powerlessness also. I'm wondering whether migration came up at all during the work of the commission, and particularly during the consultations. As I think there was another slide here that talked about adaptations that people take to their circumstances, and migration across borders may be one that would fit into that category. But a lot of times, particularly if rights are approached from the standpoints of something that state institutions guarantee to their citizens, but not something that are human rights that are guaranteed to all people, even in cases where they are provided for in international rights instruments, the protections and opportunities afforded to migrants aren't going to be there, or even if they are formally on the books, then people will have less access to the institutions that would help to uphold them. So I'm curious whether this came up at all during the consultations, and whether you think this is this sort of model could also be applied to questions of policy towards migration and immigration reform.
Michael Kisileski, and I just finished a year-long consultancy with the Center on Housing Rights and Evictions in Geneva, and so I just returned to DC, and I guess that makes me a job seeker in a robust economy right now. But anyway, I think your process-based model for legal empowerment could benefit an awful lot from examining some of the failures at the state and local level and at the international level with respect to a different kind of property rights, and I'm referring to intellectual property rights. If you look carefully at the intellectual property rights regime, for example, access and benefits sharing agreements among traditional ecological knowledge and genetic resources, you'll find that there's been a sort of a similar process of marginalization and exclusion of impoverished peoples who oftentimes are the keepers of very highly valuable genetic resources that can be used towards a robust economy and a thriving agriculture and the preservation thereof, and including biological materials. And we find that oftentimes it's actually not even multinational or domestic corporations that are interfering so much as the state government itself that prevents those who are keepers of this knowledge from being able to participate in international decision-making processes with respect to control over biological resources, and the state kind of misappropriates that. And I almost see a parallel between that and land and property rights, and, as you put it, business rights. So this is not a question as much as it is a suggestion for maybe when you re-examine your strategies and approaches in the future concerning legal empowerment, that you might want to take intellectual property rights or IPRs into account. Thank you.
Krista Jacobs at the International Center for Research on Women. We are actually becoming involved in some community-based paralegal work in Uganda. Mm-hmm. And besides the challenge of lack of awareness and lack of access to justice, another thing that we're really coming up against is this duality of the customary legal system and the statutory legal system, where the basic gist of it is there's been carved space set aside for the customary system, but if anything conflicts with the Constitution should prevail. So my question, and this may be unanswerable, so I apologize, is what advice do you have for how to change or replace what is harmful in customary systems in terms of actually depriving people of their property rights and human rights with the more lofty or even practical pieces of statutory law? How do you start to change those customary norms that are harmful to agree more with human rights law?
My name is Patricia Biermeyer, and I am professor at Georgetown University. Thank you, Dr. Singh. It's really good to see the whole perspective. of the different aspects of law and particularly business law. I will say that's very interesting. My question is very concrete and short. You talk about the labor and in the informal sector. One of the aspects that I wrote down was that you mentioned there is a need to support minimum packages of labor rights or bundles of rights for the informal economy. And my question is, how would you implement that? How would you go about that? Because Marty Chan from Harvard and Lourdes Veneria from Cornell have worked extensively on the informal sector. And one of the things that I still think is missing in all what I have seen is the gender perspective. For only one reason, women are extremely or highly, I will say, represented in the rural poor. And how would you do that? How would you start with a bundle of rights that would be compulsory, could be voluntary? How would you engage the people who, at least in the areas of the world where I used to work a lot, Latin America, you don't exist, even though you are the 80 or 90% of the workforce? Thank you.
On the issue of migrants came up, was one of the most difficult things we dealt with. And yes, I did use the phrase active citizens and effective states right through my presentation. And we know that human rights are not the same as citizens' rights. Human rights for all people, whether they're migrants or citizens. So that debate came up and we dealt with it. We decided that we would focus the large majority of the people of the world, the poor of the world. By far the large majority are in fact people who are born in states and are living right where they were born and are in fact citizens. So our focus was on those people who are supposed to be citizens and who have no economic, cultural, and social rights and cannot get out of poverty. And we made reference only in passing that these issues now need to be considered for refugees, for migrants of various kinds, and to be taken up. We did not pronounce in any serious way any recommendations on migrants. We focused by far our effort on people who are citizens or who were born within a country and do not have the rights of citizens. So unfortunately, we didn't say very much on the issue of refugees and migrants. But we recognize that the issue of human rights are applicable to all across the borders, and therefore many of these principles should be applicable, but they will require all kinds of trans-border agreements and international covenants and so on, which probably requires another piece of work. On the area of intellectual property rights, we again decided that we didn't want to get into TRIPS and a whole range of stuff. We debated it for a little while and then said, okay, there are a whole range of people who are dealing with intellectual property rights. However, we will draw from the lessons that they have. And in our process, if you look at it, you will find that virtually all the principles that will make intellectual property rights help the poor economically are in fact the same principles that are at work here that will make them use any other asset. And in fact, we see intellectual property as another asset. In my chart on assets, under human capital, I have intellectual property rights as one of the aspects. So we did take that on board, but didn't want to get that very thorny, as you know, and complex debate, which we could. One of the things I suspect that helped me to help the Commission to finish this thing on time and on budget was to remain focused in a way as far as we could. On the issue of women and the issues in Uganda, the whole question about are human rights universal? Are they are harmful practices which are not consistent? Should culture trump human rights or vice versa? Should customary rights or constitutional law trump customary law? The way I will approach that, and the way I believe that it can be answered is the following. At least we have all agreed that human rights are universal. So we have something to start with. Now, in a given cultural setting, one has to be careful how you proceed. It's more a matter now of tact than of substance. And I believe that participatory approaches, approaches based on education and clarifications are the way to go forward, and building coalitions for change. You might get champions in those local organizations, a local level, and they should begin by talking at length in the evenings when they sit under the tree, talking it through. If you try to impose it, imposition of democracy does not work, which we have learned, haven't we? Maybe not, I don't know. But nor does imposition of human rights. Obvious and self-evident as it might appear to many of us in some parts of the world, will not work. But by a gradual process of inculcation and explanation, I think it will work. And that will be my answer. So sorry if I disappointed you by answering it. On the final question on the issue of women's rights, and I should have, and I might have jumped it over, the two issues that the Commission took special care to integrate across its work were women, gender equality, women's rights, and indigenous peoples, and to make sure we gave those two special attention for reasons that will be self-evident. In the case of women, we all recognize the points you make. In the case of indigenous peoples, it's very different. The first mistake that I made was to talk about inclusive system of law with indigenous peoples. They kick you out of the room. So you got to deal with that in a very different and special way, recognizing, I'm Canadian, I live in Canada, and sometimes I want to feel proud of being a Canadian, and because we haven't had colonies or something like that. So one reason. I was born in a British colony myself before I moved to Canada. But then I heard a human rights lawyer for indigenous peoples in Canada referring to Canada as one of the world's worst colonizers as far as First Nations are concerned. Wow. Powerful speaker too. So yeah, we have issues there with indigenous peoples and women, and we have given those two special attention. Now this minimum package. We made Marty Chen a member of the working group on two working groups, business rights and labor rights, for that same reason. So we listen to WIGO a lot, the World Informal Sector Group. And we believe that this can be done. And the way you would have to do it is the way, in fact, that chart, I should have acknowledged it. Where I have waste pickers, those two little charts are drawn from Marty Chen. And she believes that the way forward on getting these packages of rights is to take any one of those groups, waste pickers, domestic workers, non-farm laborers, whatever group, and begin to talk with them, with people-based organizations. The classic one, of course, is SEWA. Yeah, big success story, which is really a trade union, but it's of women, 70,000 strong. And Ella Batt's very well-written book, which you probably would have seen, We Are Poor, But We Are So Many.
But then what you are encouraging is the bottom-up approach.
Yes, correct.
Organizing people. My question is, what would you do as a government, for example?
Aha.
What would you do in the opposite way? You don't recognize that people, they are in the informal sector, unless that, okay, you go and you encourage them to get together. But how would you do that? Is compulsory? Would be compulsory? Would be ad hoc? Everybody would.
Right. The answer to that is, you see how we structured our commission? If you look at who is on this commission, you will see they are all former politicians, or almost. Yeah. Well, even Larry Summers is a former politician, right? So, and the reason for that is, how do you get a state to become pro-poor? I argue that most states, or all states, are not pro-poor. They're anti-poor, most states, and so it will be difficult. But just as you're building coalitions for change at the grassroots level for bottom-up, our approach is a top-down, bottom-up approach. And you build the same coalitions for change with the state and show them why it is in their advantage to begin to introduce these packages of rights. Most of the states, the current political leaders that we spoke to many of them, are ready to introduce these packages. A classic example is child labor. I was, not in this commission, but sitting and watching how we were able to get the labor commissioner, the employer, the parent, and the child who is in doing child labor to sit together and begin to negotiate a way out of it. You will not do it by passing a legislation that makes it illegal overnight. So it is a gradual package of rights that are negotiated by the actors, and compensation might have to take place where the state can provide that compensation. But the bottom-up pressure is critical to success. And to have 500 children in a village chanting all day, school is for children, work is for adults, in their local language, can have an impact on local politicians. So yes, the top-down can take place as well.